Hi friends, I'm Red Stegall. I'm an entertainer, author, and proud Texas rancher. I'm inviting my fellow cattle ranchers to join me in the Alamo statewide stampede, a simple way to help preserve our Texas heritage. When you sell your livestock, just let the auction house know you'd like some or all of the proceeds to go to the Remember the Alamo Foundation. If you don't have livestock, no problem. You can still take part by making a donation. These tax-deductible donations will go directly to the Alamo Plan, which is preserving the Alamo for generations to come. And together we'll ensure we always remember the Alamo.
Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast. An impossible gun that could shoot 5 or 6 times before reloading. An inventor from Connecticut made it possible at a time when the young Republic of Texas needed weapons. Today we reveal why making this impossible gun nearly broke Samuel Colt, and how a Texas Ranger with ideas to make it better reversed his fortunes, saved the business, and secured them both places in Texas history books. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. Today we're joined by the Alamo senior researcher and historian, Kolby Lanham. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Always happy to be here.
Before we dive in, let's talk about why the Alamo collects Samuel Colt firearms. His heyday came around after the battle. So how does it tie into our story here?
Colt is an American legend, and his fame is cemented into American history, like those of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. His ties to Texas date all the way back to the very beginning of his manufacturing of firearms, and they have a deep and storied history that ties in directly with the Alamo, being that his first patent happened during the siege on February 25th of 1836. So there's lots of ties, but then even the military history, as it spans a long period here in Texas and at the Alamo itself, Colt's involved in all of that.
So who is Samuel Colt, this Connecticut man who wrote himself into Texas history?
Colt, I say that he has a storied history with Texas, but his story itself is one of struggle, one of trying to find oneself. And it starts off very early on. His mother passed away when he was 6 years old, and he has 2 sisters that die and 1 brother that passes away. Well, and then another brother was suicide later on. And so he starts off kind of a troubled childhood in a lot of ways. By 11 years old, he's indentured to work at a farm. This is a similar story we hear with other individuals with a Texas story, David Crockett, who was sent off to work off and learn an apprenticeship, basically, and he doesn't take well to it, neither does Colt in this instance. So you kind of see a story that happens over and over again in that regard.
Around this time, he gets this idea of building the impossible gun that would shoot 5 or 6 times without reloading. No one had done it before.
Yeah, this wasn't a thing that people were really thinking about. You had one shot with a muzzle-loaded firearm that's not rifled. It's 20 seconds per shot, and that was just the norm, and everyone had kind of grown to accept it. There were firearms that are coming around with a series of rotating barrels, but not a rotating cylinder. That was thought to be impossible.
He also enjoyed pyrotechnics as a teenager.
I mean, what teenager does not like pyrotechnics? When I saw this, I read a book called The Revolver. It was about his life. I did not realize that his time with pyrotechnics and that explosive went so hand in hand with his manufacturing of firearms.
When he's still a teenager, he starts building his own guns, inventing the first revolving cylinder handgun in 1831. How did that gun work?
Yeah, this is the first true revolver. As I mentioned, there were guns with rotating barrels like a pepper box pistol. We have some of those on display in the Ralston Family Collection Center right when you come in. Those guns had a design where you had to manually spin the barrel like a pepper box grinder or pepper grinder in your kitchen. And you had to hope that those barrels lined up just right or they would blow up. And Colt, I believe it was Colt who was quoted as saying that those guns were more dangerous on the operators than the muzzle end because they had a tendency to blow people's fingers off, and it was very dangerous. And so this gun is very different because he scraps the idea of having revolving barrels like everyone else was doing and comes up with a revolving cylinder and a stationary barrel. And he gets the idea while he's on a ship learning another trade. And this is kind of a funny story with Colt. It's like his dad has problems or his parents have problems with it, so they send him away. He's having trouble in school, so he goes to the apprenticeship. Well, then he's having trouble there, so they send him off to sea to learn that trade. And I've heard of being sent off to boarding school, which they do send him to, but I never heard of sending him off to a ship. But while he's on there, on that ship, he sees the windlass, which is used to crank sails and things of that nature. And then the capstan, which is the large object that's round, has handles on it, and raises the anchor on a ship. And so by seeing that, he gets these ideas of a revolving cylinder. That's where the first true revolver comes along. Now it's a failure. The first prototype does explode, which is not good, but he's onto something.
At this point, Colt's life takes an interesting turn. He's 18, he needs to make money. He starts doing street performances and museum lectures about, of all things, laughing gas.
Yeah, he gets this notoriety as a celebrated doctor. They called him Dr. Colt of New York, London, and Calcutta, which is a heck of a title. He's also a showman. This is going to come in useful for him in the future when he starts trying to sell his firearms. He uses that time as a doctor, quote unquote, to really, show off his wares. And this kind of backfires a little bit because he gets this reputation as a doctor, and there's a cholera epidemic on board of a riverboat. And he's brought on to try to treat the patients. And you can imagine he's kind of standing there and
he's not a real doctor.
Not a real doctor. And so what does he do for these patients? He administers laughing gas to them. That's not going to treat cholera, but probably made him feel a little bit better for the time being.
But he doesn't give up on the idea of the impossible gun. And in February 1836, smack in the middle of the Texas Revolution, his design gets patented. And it becomes known as the Patterson revolver because it's made in Patterson, New Jersey.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So he does have some success with his time as a doctor. He does stage shows, including pyrotechnics and fireworks at the end, which is pretty popular. And he takes that money and starts putting it back toward the impossible gun. And as you mentioned, he gets it patented, files first patent in February 25th of 1836. But a friend of his who was at the U.S. Patent Office said, before you file an American patent, you need to go to London and you need to go to Paris and file patents there. And then that'll give you grounds in the United States to file this patent. And so the first patent in England is 6909. And then in the U.S., it's 9430X. And that's called the revolving gun.
What are the attributes of a Patterson revolver?
So the Patterson revolver obviously had a rotating cylinder. You would preload that cylinder, and you'd have to take the gun partially apart to do this. And then you'd reassemble the gun, and you had 5 shots. It's not a 6-shooter, it's a 5-shooter. It also had a couple of quirky things. When you cocked the hammer, it released a mechanism inside the frame of the gun, and it dropped the trigger. And then the first Patterson was known as what we call jokingly as the baby Patterson, but is also known as the number 1 because there'll be 5 iterations of this Patterson gun, and it was very small and very underpowered. And so it had a couple of those key components, but it was a true revolver.
We have one in the Alamo collection.
We sure do. So we have a number 1 Patterson. The serial number's in the 60s, and I think he only made about 200 of them.
He starts a manufacturing company on March 5th, 1836, the day before the Battle of the Alamo.
Yeah, and he calls it the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company out of Patterson, New Jersey. He's partially bankrolled by friends and family. So he's getting a start. Unfortunately for Colt, it's not going to go well early on.
He manufactures 1,000 guns in just under 2 years. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. The manufacturing process took quite some time because of the pieces and the intricacy involved in the firearms.
There's just one problem. No one's buying them.
Yeah, there's a panic called the Panic of 1837, which lasts into the 1840s. And this is partially brought on by the decline of cotton sales worldwide, but also the land bubble. There was a lot of land. People start moving west, and then there's so much land that it drops the value of that. And so people aren't really buying firearms. The other issue is that the Militia Act of 1808, which basically states that militias within the state can't buy firearms unless they've been pre-approved by the active military, the federal government. And so even though he's friendly with some of these state militias, they can't buy his gun because they're handicapped by federal law.
But the weapons do get tested in battle. Tell us about the Seminole War in Florida.
Yeah, so some of his guns make it into the Seminole War. The soldiers respond very positively to the gun. They have more firepower now. They can put more rounds down on target, which is great. Some of the men were a little curious about the guns and pulled them apart, and they broke pieces of them. And so that didn't bode well for Colt. They do see success in the Seminole War. Samuel Walker, who's going to come in later in our story, uses a couple of them in the Seminole War. Something else about this is that since they were purchased, he made quite a bit of money he could dump back into his company, which is a great thing. Unfortunately for Colt, he is on a ship that gets kind of stuck in a river, and there's no wind to move it along, and so they're struggling. So he takes it upon himself to get 2 sailors, a young Army officer, and a couple other people to get inside of a boat to try to row him ashore, which is great. He leaves with him leaves all the guns on the boat, and then he takes his check for around $6,250 with him. But unfortunately, the boat capsizes, his luggage is lost, and he loses the check, and that's what leads to his bankruptcy.
Wow. In 1839, the Republic of Texas does order 180 revolvers from Colt for the Texian Navy. What made the young republic want these weapons?
This was something new. The Texas government was trying to outfit their soldiers and sailors, and they were trying to keep up with the demands. You look to your northern neighbor, the United States, and other countries. You look to your southern neighbor, who is sometimes your enemy, sometimes your friend, and you want to make sure your guys have the most up-to-date firearms. And so they buy these guns. Unfortunately, they don't really take on.
In a way, though, it's a match made in heaven because Texas needs weapons, Colt needs customers.
Yeah, a true story of like supply and demand.
There's a battle that Texas takes part started in 1843 in the Yucatan Peninsula, where these guns really get tested by the Texan Navy. Tell us about it.
Yeah, this battle is between the Texian Navy and some volunteer forces against the Mexican government, and the Texans have allied themselves with the people of the Yucatan who are fighting against the government. So Texas takes part in that. Commodore Moore is leading that charge, and this is one of the most interesting naval battles in not just Texas history, but American history, that sailing ships took on steam-powered ships, and the sailing ships did very well, and it's really a draw, but the Texans take it as a win when the Mexican Army has to go back to port to refit and rearm.
So the weapons did well, but as you said, there's just a lot going against Colt's company right now. It goes bankrupt.
Yeah, so it goes belly up, unfortunately, which leaves him almost penniless, but also with a lot of debt to friends and family. And those people had kind of stuck their necks out there, and they're wanting their money back.
Even though Colt's company has failed, the guns make an impression on Captain Samuel Walker of the Texas Rangers. He actually acquires some of these early Colt revolvers, and they get battle tested again here in Texas.
That's right. So Walker had used some of them in the Seminole War, as we mentioned. And then when he's under another Walker captain named Hayes, they used them throughout Texas. And one of the battles they used them at is the Battle of Walker's Creek in 1844, where the Texans are outnumbered, but because of the gun and the revolving capacity, they were able to fend off an attack by Comanche and their allies.
Is this something that the Native American population had ever seen before at this point?
To my knowledge and my research, this is new to them, and they weren't expecting that. You know, a lot of the skirmishes and fights that happened between Anglos and Native Americans in this area were kind of a run and gun. The Texans, if they're using a rifle, could take up to a minute to reload one bullet. The Comanche, Apache, and others knew that, and so they were more of a scrap. It was you're trading shots, but in this instance, the Texans had more firepower, and they could fire more rounds at a quicker rate, and that was just something that they couldn't really cope with, they being the indigenous people.
So before, if it took a minute to reload a rifle or musket, you can get off a couple of bow and arrow shots in that time.
They said that a good Comanche on horseback or Apache or even Kiowa could let loose 7 to 12 arrows in a minute. And so if you're reloading a rifle, it takes a minute, or a musket that takes about 20 seconds, that's a pretty dire situation. And we're talking about reloading times whenever it's peaceful, not in battle. So a lot of things happen in the heat of battle. And so this gun is going to change everything for Texas, but also for America.
Yeah, you can really tell it's a game changer. And Captain John Coffee Hayes is really impressed afterward.
Yeah, he says, I cannot recommend these arms too highly. And Zachary Taylor, future president of the United States, sends Walker to New York in 1846 to meet this Samuel Colt.
Yeah, they start corresponding, and it's fair to say what they come up with truly changes the world.
Yeah, they were kind of cut from the same cloth. These two men get along almost immediately. We have a saying, they got along like a house on fire. And it's a good saying for these two men, both very bold, daring, and both their ideas, but also, you can see that through Walker and what he's doing on the field of battle.
They come up with what's called the Walker Colt revolver. How is it different from the Patterson model?
The Walker Colt is so different from the Patterson. The Patterson, as I said, had a trigger that dropped out of the frame. The Walker has a stationary trigger with a trigger guard. The Patterson had a very light load of gunpowder and a very small bullet. The Walker is still one of the most powerful handguns ever created by man, and at the time was the most powerful handgun until the .357 Magnum came about. The Patterson had to be partially disassembled to reload. The Walker can be reloaded on the fly with a stationary fixed loading lever to make it easier. And like I said, the big difference really is the stopping power. I mean, you shoot someone with a .36 caliber ball, it may not kill them. It may actually just make them more angry. But if you shoot them with a 44, 45 caliber slug with a full rifle load of powder, which is what the Walker would have carried, it's going to do some serious damage. There's even stories of these men using these guns to hunt buffalo. So extremely powerful.
Colt has the know-how of how to make guns, but Walker knows what he needs in battle. He came to Colt with some specifications.
Yeah, he sure did. So he basically said, we want a stationary trigger. We want 6 shots instead of 5, and it has to be able to kill a man or a horse. That's a big task, and Colt was up for it. Something that's kind of funny about it is when Walker goes up there to New York and finds Samuel Colt, he tells him about that pistol and the use of the Patterson, and Colt's very excited, but Colt doesn't let him know that his company had already went belly up and that he was working for Eli Whitney's grandson in his factory. And Colt just says, yeah, we can do that. Let's make it happen. And so with those funds, what do you know? Colt's back on his feet.
We have one of these Walker Colts in our collection.
We sure do. We are one of the few institutions in the world that has an original Walker Colt. There were 1,100 of them initially made, 1,000 for the military market, 1,000 for the civilian market, and we are lucky enough to have an original Walker Colt.
One of the things you like doing when you show people the collection is showing the difference, that they can physically see the Patterson Colt and the Walker Colt, and you show them, here's exactly how it's different.
Yeah. If you're comparing the Walker Colt and the Patterson, the number one Patterson, it's kind of like on Men in Black whenever they give Will Smith the noisy cricket. It's so small and people laugh at it. And I have to imagine that a man pulling that out in anger had to have made some people laugh. I mean, it's very small, but then you see the Walker and that thing means business.
Walker ordered 1,000 of them in January 1847. And this revolver practically changes Samuel Colt's fortunes overnight. Why did this weapon take such hold, not just here in Texas, but across America?
When Walker puts in that order and it's authorized by the federal government, that's what Colt has wanted all along. He wanted a federal contract. It is going to change his life forever, but it also changes everything about the United States. This revolver changes combat. It moves into a revolving rifle, a revolving shotgun, later on the repeating rifle, and eventually other firearms that'll be used to win the American West.
It becomes part of the myth of the American West, really.
It really does. You will be hard-pressed to find any painting, drawing, or account of American cowboys or peace officers that don't have a Colt on their hip.
Something I find really interesting is that Colt really mastered the manufacturing process. He created molds to make those basic pieces.
Yeah, I think we give the nod to the assembly line to Henry Ford, but Colt was ahead of his time.
This all made it faster to manufacture and it brought down costs, so it was affordable to the average person.
That's exactly right. But also, if you're a government agency and you have a gunsmith, and instead of having to send a gun off to get fixed or having to buy a whole new firearm, you had readily available parts and you could just mix and match, trade them out. And we see that with the Walker. It sees extensive use in the Mexican-American War. And then you can look at some of the existing Walkers and they've got serial numbers that are mismatched because they would take a trigger guard off that gun and fix this one, or this one had a blown out barrel, so they'd trade the cylinder out. And so you're seeing his idea of this manufacturing process happening live on the battlefield.
That makes sense. Earlier, when you were talking about the Patterson revolver, you mentioned soldiers were taking it apart and then they couldn't really get it back together, or they didn't have the right parts, or they broke some of the parts.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
The gun that followed all this, made by Colt, has been referred to as a peacemaker. It's an interesting choice of words that can certainly be parsed from a 2025 perspective. But what did that mean in their time?
Yeah, in 1873 makes the gun now known as the Peacemaker. This gun was used by law enforcement. A lot of sheriffs carried it. And wherever they carried that, they knew that there's likely going to be peace because men didn't want to go up against that firearm.
What kind of gun was used in the Civil War that was born out of what Colt and Walker created?
Yeah, so they take that design, they polish it up, and it continues to be used. You can see that in the Navy models, which is a smaller caliber, but preferred because it's very accurate. In some cases, men like to carry that gun more than the Army, which would be a 44 caliber.
This is a big example of how combat changed in just the 25 years or so between the Texas Revolution and the Civil War.
Oh, yeah. The innovation in that short time span is absolutely crazy.
Colt was a master of marketing, as you alluded to in his laughing gas period. He used product placement and art and advertising to sell guns, and even came up with the slogan, "God created men, Colonel Colt made them equal."
Yeah, he knew exactly what he was doing when he was marketing firearms. There's one example that he uses when he's talking to Sultan for the Ottoman Empire, and he's trying to sell them guns, and they're kind of hesitant. And he said, well, Russia bought a bunch of them recently, and they didn't want to be outdone, and that was their enemy, so they placed a huge order. Russia had not bought any guns, but then he went to Russia afterwards and told him, hey, Turkey just bought a bunch of guns, or the Ottoman Empire just bought a bunch of guns, and Russia said, well, we can't have that, so they bought a bunch. So Colt was playing everyone against everybody, and it happens kind of in the Civil War. When the Civil War breaks out, Colt doesn't pick a side. Colt sees opportunity. This is exactly what he always wanted, so he's selling guns initially to the South and the North. And people start calling him un-American and things of that nature. And so he kind of slows down the sale, and even eventually stops the sale of guns to the South.
In that slogan, he refers to himself as Colonel Colt, and he wasn't a true colonel.
No, that's kind of an honorary title that you'll see a lot of people carrying during that period.
He never forgot his roots. Several Colt models included engraving from the Battle of Campeche battle scene, because the truth is, Texas saved him.
Yeah, he never forgot that. And that was something about Colt throughout his life. Those people that helped him early on, he paid his debts. He helped friends. He helped family in a lot of ways. He never really forgot where he came from.
In 2021, the Texas State Legislature declared the Walker Colt the official handgun of the state of Texas. It just shows the legacy and how the fates of Texas and Samuel Colt were intertwined.
Maybe some people would disagree with me, but I don't think Colt would have been who he was without Texas. The firearms that are being used here, the combat that's putting those kind of firearms through the rigorous testing, Colt needed that to really get on his feet, and not to mention the money that kind of was infused into his business.
It's fair to say, like the title of this episode, Texas saved Samuel Colt.
That's exactly right.
Kolby, Lanham, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We have linked to photos of the original Colt revolvers in the Alamo's collection. We've also linked to a webpage on Colt revolvers on the Texas State Historical Association's website. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.